Well, there's something different about today. When I woke up this morning, the world just felt a little more serene. I do not believe God directly chooses our leaders, but I am glad God raised up the president-elect and vice president-elect to help the soul of this nation. So this morning, I don't know, my first cup of coffee tasted a little bolder and more flavorful, and the early hints of the sunrise looked brighter. The last leaves on the maple trees in my front yard looked more vivid. There is something different about today. Watching a nationwide block party break out in celebration. If you are a person of African heritage, maybe you can breathe more deeply. If you are a dreamer, maybe you can breathe more deeply. If you are an indigenous person, maybe you can breathe more deeply. If you are Muslim, maybe you can breathe more deeply. If you are a legal or asylum-seeking immigrant, maybe you can breathe more deeply. If you are part of the LGBTQ plus community, maybe you can breathe more deeply. If you are a child hoping for a healthy future, maybe today you can breathe more deeply. There is something different about today. I woke up and I did not feel fear, worry, panic, or anger. And that is not how I felt 4 years ago. I remember the day after the election of 2016. If you are newer to our church, you may not know some of our recent history around our public commitment to Black Lives Matter and how that unfolded after the previous election. So let me refresh our memories for a moment. I'd like to share some pictures with you. And for some of you, maybe this is the first time you're seeing some of these. This is the night of the election, day after the election, November 9th, 2016. I drove up to the church to go to my office and had noticed that the Black Lives Matter banner that we have always hung in front of our church had been vandalized yet again. This time, the word black slashed out of the banner and left to hang there. This is not the first time this had happened to our banner, but seeing that reaction right after the election caused all kinds of feelings inside of me at that moment. Anger that we had been vandalized yet again, wondering who did that, assuming maybe it was someone in our neighborhood, because the church's neighborhood, because this had happened again. And I don't know, wondering the perceptions of people who see this and feel traumatized over and over again. When every time someone makes a statement like this, that somehow their lives don't matter as much as everyone else's. Again, this was not the first time this had happened in our congregation. And in January 15th of 2015, it was the first time we had put a banner out on Colesville Road. It was MLK weekend. And I remember driving up to church that Sunday morning. It was a cold, really cold, rainy, almost icy morning. And we had seen someone had scratched out the word black, spray painted over it, written all over the sign and left it to hang there. And I took that sign down that morning before worship. I hung it over the chancel so we could all see it. We had a discussion about this as a congregation about how we felt seeing this sign. And as part of our public response to this, we purchased Black Lives Matter lawn signs, consecrated them, put them all in the front yard of the church for people to see, had a little service out there, and invited our members and friends to bring them home with them, put them in their own yards. Fast forward a few, many months, almost a year and a half later, and we had this vandalism happen again. Again, this had happened a few times to our sign in the past. By November 11th, a couple of days later, maybe you remember some of our neighborhood friends, our neighbors in the Indian Spring community came over to the church at night and fixed our Black Lives Matter sign. They replaced the word black. The neighbors had taken their own Black Lives Matter signs and put them on our lawns. As far as I know, these weren't CCC church members. These were members of the wider community who had heard what happened and heard about this vandalism and wanted to make sure that they were supporting our vision and values, but also the wider message of Black Lives Matter. So they put this sign up that said that this had been done with their help and with their love. And we left this up for a number of days too. It mattered so much to me to know that there was this kind of response. And so we were always holding these two things in balance, right? That we knew that there were people who didn't like the message that we were proclaiming as a church and would destroy property to do it. And also there were people coming in and joining with us and expressing values of inclusion and openness and justice for people who are, we felt were not receiving and is still not receiving full justice and full belonging in our community. A couple days later, it was a Sunday right after church, we had gotten notification that the Episcopal Church in Hillendale had been vandalized. People had spray painted the outside walls of the church, and then this is a church that had a Spanish-speaking mass, Spanish-speaking service, and a big Latinx population in that area. And someone had taken the sign advertising the Spanish mass and put Trump Nation whites only, and also spray painted that on the side of the church. And so I went there with colleagues in ministry to support the people of that church and to let people know that love wins. But it was so amazing to us to know that this kind of vandalism, these kind of feelings were happening in Montgomery County and being expressed so much right after the 2016 election. A couple days after that, we had a visit from our friends at the Muslim Community Center on New Hampshire Ave, who had heard about the vandalism at our church and delivered flowers and wanted to know that they were thinking of us and that we were in affinity with each other. And that was so meaningful to me, knowing how much fear and suppression the Muslim community felt, even in Montgomery County, to the point where some people were afraid to go to the mosque to worship. And there was talk of maybe having to have like angels guarding the sidewalks on the outside so people felt like they could go to worship freely. So to have the Muslim community reach out to us and offer their heartfelt affinity with us was so meaningful. And then remember, a few days right after that, student protests started in Montgomery County and DC and beyond, walkouts of our public schools where the students were protesting the results of the election. So I share all that with you just to, you know, again, not only refresh our memories and kind of get ourselves back in that mindset and think about what we had done as a response, but also to remember that the racism we saw in our communities was so much more closer to the surface than we wanted to admit. So we heard about swastikas being drawn on the walls of a county middle school, a swastika burned into a football field in Potomac. Across the country, we heard accounts of those, like a Muslim woman who had her hijab ripped off and was told to strangle herself with it. Students and adults in many different parts of the country told the Latinx community to quote, go home to Mexico. We're getting that wall now. And when asked about why they voted for Trump, some voters admitted, he says the things I'm thinking. And we wondered, you know, who knew so many tens of millions of white Americans were thinking unconscionable things about their fellow Americans? Who knew that tens of millions of white men felt so weakened by women and challenged by, you know, so-called minorities? Who knew that after years of seeming progress on race and gender, tens of millions of Americans lived in resentment, waiting for a demagogue to arrive who would legitimize our worst selves and channel it into political power? So all to say, there's something different about today. There is something different, and there's something the same. Right? After all, a change is going to come, and a little less than half the country voted to keep the status quo in place. And that means our job is not done yet. I've been thinking quite a bit lately about what it means to be the church in this time and place. Yesterday, our next step as CCC became clearer to me. We are responsible for how the actions we take influence our society in its treatment of the least of these, the stranger, the outcast, those who are lost, those who are struggling, commitment to the poor and disadvantaged among us. This is a critical part of Christian social teaching, and a Christian public social ethic invites the community, the wider community, to overcome every form of exploitation and oppression. We not only alleviate the most urgent needs in society, but we also uncover the roots of evil and sin and make social, political, and economic structures more just and humane. So when I think about the meaning of public life for Christians, I turn to this passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Our job is to be reconcilers, ambassadors. That's what the author of 2 Corinthians tells the church. The reason Christ came is to show us how much God loves this world, how much God wants to bring people closer to wholeness and healing and closer to one another. So think of yourselves as ambassadors entrusted with this ministry of reconciliation. Think of yourselves as the ones who build bridges and do the work of healing. Use the power of Christ's love to connect people in ways deeper than words. 2 Corinthians 5 says God is making an appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back to God. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back. There are no strangers in the American experience. There are no strangers in our public life. We are building a community of reconciliation where all can participate equally and fully. We may not agree. We don't have to. Our strength is how we engage one another in our diversity. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back. God's love for you has nothing to do with your economic status or where you live or what you do for a job or where you come from or what you believe. We are building a community of reconciliation where outsiders are not a threat. A healthy public life engages in the challenging and vexing work of citizenship, especially as we debate basic principles of how best to carry out the unique calling that is America's. And so I offer this plea. It's the words of Abraham Lincoln, delivered at a most perilous time in our nation's history. And I think his words are still needed today. He said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained it, must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely as they will be, by the better angels of our nature." You know, the truth is most people are good and decent. We want the best for ourselves and our families. Most people have good morals and values, but let's be clear, public good does not automatically flow from private virtue. And just because a person is upright does not mean he or she or they will serve the cause of justice. Good people do not always challenge the status quo. Moral people do not always take that which is merely legal and make it more ethical as well. Upright people do not always speak truth to power or take personal action against that which keeps us from living into our fullest potential for the common good. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking with my neighbor who has just received two corneal transplants. And a few years ago, he also had a kidney transplant, and the kidney was donated by his only child. And when we were talking about his recovery, he said, you know, Matt, when I go outside, I always wear a mask. I stay away from people. If I get coronavirus and die, it will dishonor the people whose corneas and kidney are keeping me alive and helping me to see again. And if I get sick, it would be like spitting on their sacrifices. Yeah. So I want to say to our newly elected Democratic leaders, I want you to be more like my neighbor and make sure you always value the gifts and the sacrifices of those who brought you to this time and place, and recognize and honor the Black leaders, the Black women, and other activists who just handed you a win. And for all of us as allies who say Black Lives Matter and pushed hard and hoped hard for this election result, we cannot become complacent now. Please make a plan to do something for our communities. Join a local group, make local change, back up Black and LGBTQ plus and Indigenous, Asian, Latinx, Muslim, African, Jewish, immigrant, and other abled leaders and organizations on the front line of progress. We must do better. And I'm starting with myself. We have so much work to do, my friends. The work of healing is hard and holy work. And that's only the beginning of what it means to become new creations. We do it with our faith, walking into a new reality in which the old things pass away and new things come. Today, the weight of the work seems less burdensome, more bearable. We will heal as we work, some of us. Hope, love, and faithfulness are good co-workers.